Good evening, everyone. My name is Lori Ferrara, and I'm here to welcome you to tonight's Baltimore Narratives program. Our regular presenter, Jack Burkett, is off this month. In his place, we have one of our favorite guest speakers, Chesapeake educator, writer, and historian, Kate Livie. Kate is an Eastern Shore native. She is passionate about the Chesapeake Bay's culture and landscape. She is a regular contributor to Chesapeake Bay Magazine, Baltimore Magazine, and Edible Delmarva, and has hosted programs for MPT, NPR, and the History Channel. Her 2015 book, Chesapeake Oysters, The Bay's Foundation and Future, won the Maryland Historical Society's Marion Brewington Prize for Maritime History. Formerly the Director of Education and Associate Curator at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, Kate serves as humanities faculty at the Center for Environment and Society at Washington College in her hometown of Chestertown, Maryland, where she teaches courses about the Bay's environment, arts, economy, tradition, and culture. Kate's program tonight will focus on the history of tomato packing on the Eastern Shore and how the region's produce fueled industry, sparked innovative technology, shaped culture, and transformed the landscape. Tonight's presentation will be about an hour long, with time set aside at the end for questions. Please put your questions in the Zoom or QA during the program. Kate will circle back to them at the end. I want to thank those of you that donated when you registered, and to thank everyone for giving us your interest and attention this evening. And now I'll turn the program over to Kate to tell the story of the big tomato.
Hello, Baltimore Museum of Industry people. I'm very excited to share with you the next chapter I have of Chesapeake history that I hope you will find as fascinating, illuminating, sometimes saddening, but always fascinating as I do. I am going to start with the old PowerPoint. And so to get this started, I am Kate Livie. I am born on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. I am belatedly come back as an adult to my sort of roots here and realized how rich they were. And, my career has been uncovering the different stories, tangled up histories of the Chesapeake and understanding not only what makes this place, but really what has made me. And with that in mind, I want to start this talk off by explaining sort of how I became interested in this in the first place. So I wrote a book on oysters. I'm fascinated with the Chesapeake, how people have lived here, eaten here, died here, fought here, expanded here, harvested here. I want to know all these things. And it really comes from a place that my own family, is really from the Eastern Shore, the Queen Anne's County and Kent County in particular. And my papa, Hartley Bain, grew up in Crumpton, Maryland, which is on the Chester River, the same tributary I still live on. But he lived far north in this little town. And now Crumpton doesn't look like anything. It's a bunch of old houses. You would never know there had really been a community there, but he really remembered this very thriving river-oriented community. And one of the things he always talked about was how when he was a boy, he remembered his whole family going and working at the packing house in the summer, and how, it was always tomatoes. And he talked about how they just dumped the skins and the seeds into the river, and the river would turn red, the Chester River would turn red. And that was just like how you dealt with, all the, whatever you didn't want, is the river was your highway and also your trash can and sometimes also your toilet. But his father and all of his uncles had the side hustle where they would dry and save all the seeds and then put them into packages and sell the seeds for the tomatoes, so that way they were earning money from the packing house and they were earning money on the side. And it never really clicked for me, like why or how that all made sense, until I started doing research for my oyster book. And I realized that, I had already learned about this whole infrastructure, because really, so if oysters are the winter harvest, tomatoes are the summer harvest, and all the infrastructure, all the stories that go along with it are really sort of the second part of the same story. I always think about those best friends necklaces you get when you're in middle school, and it's like two parts of the same heart. That's really the story of oysters and tomatoes. And when we think about one, you really can't think about the other. But it really starts off with like eating and consuming oysters or tomatoes. So I think there's I'm not a foodways historian. I have some friends who are, but I want to delve a little bit into this because I think it's really interesting and you all might enjoy it. So the tomato is not an old world food, although we may most closely associate it with Italy. In reality, it's New World food. It's part of the nightshade family. Potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, they're all related, and they were all brought back as sort of these trophies to the old world by the conquerors. So the Spanish and the Portuguese bring these, new foods back that they've encountered in the new world through colonization. They bring it back to the old world as these novelties. And, everyone's very interested in them. They're, really cool to look at, but everyone's a little like skeeved out by what they could do to you. And, there's a sense that like the natives here in the new world, which is what they thought of them, were hardier somehow and could eat these potentially poisonous foods. And because they're part tomato, accurately, tomatoes are part of the nightshade family. There's a sense that like belladonna, they are going to poison you and like end your life. So, but they're so beautiful. So people end up planting tomatoes as an ornamental plant in the 16th and 17th centuries. And, they're like, oh, my tomato is so beautiful as my, and they're growing other things at the same time, like, castor bean and things like that. Again, these are like plants that are relatively toxic and could potentially kill you, but are still very ornamental and valued for that ornamental element. So it isn't until tomatoes come back to the New World again through colonists. So the tomatoes are brought back to the New World through not just English colonists, but also Spanish colonists and French who are colonizing the Gulf Coast area when we think of sort of like New Orleans. And so as far as I can tell, and I feel like this is an expanding area of research and that you could do a lot more here, is that tomatoes really got their toehold in through that sort of Cajun traditional type of recipe, and from there expanded in the 18th century. Now, there's not a lot of recipes given, and when they are mentioned, they're talked about in the Carolina region. And so the first sort of talk about what tomatoes are and what they can do and how you can actually eat them, not just, enjoy them from a distance, is tomatoes in one of the earliest cookbooks of the 19th century. So here's a plate that shows you sort of tomatoes growing on the vine. It's one of the very early documents that was sent back talking, and you can see this is when we think about heirloom tomatoes, this is a good example, right? It's like knobbly, it's got ridges on all sides. This is a good example of what tomatoes, we're going back to, but the original tomatoes look like. And so Mary Randolph in 1824 publishes a cookbook. Now, when we think about cookbooks, these aren't recipes she developed like, at her kitchen table that afternoon. This is very much a compilation of tried and true recipes that would have been perfected, not just at her table, but in her kind of community. And maybe not just from her, but maybe her grandmother. I mean, think about how we get recipes and disseminate recipes today. So it's not so different in this time period. The exception being, of course, that Mary Randolph may have cooked some, but her enslaved cooks certainly cooked more. So there's a sense that you've got this tomato, this basic food stuff that's being kind of infused into the foodways from the South, which is how we get a lot of our sort of traditional American cookery. And Mary Randolph is just putting it on paper. So it's 1824, and she publishes a bunch, really the first American recipes around tomatoes. And it's like scalloped tomatoes, okra and tomato. I mean, if there was like a mashup of sort of the African diaspora and the new sort of new world, old world, new world diaspora, it's like okra and tomato together. And, you know, this becomes like trendy. There becomes this sort of fad for tomatoes in the early 19th century, which up until this point had been just a decorative plant and had really transcended that status to become something that people not only were familiar with, but were really like seeking. And it makes sense. I mean, when you think about seasonal foods, so, you know, your strawberry, your cherry, your peaches, your tomato, you know, they all reflect this sort of brief moment at the height of production where everything's super delicious and everything you eat is made out of this thing. And it's so special. And then as soon as it goes away, you don't have it again for a year. And so there's this like clamor for tomatoes that's more than really what you can produce. And so there's also a lot of like quackery around tomatoes in this era, where they're associated with sort of like their health benefits. And there's this idea that sort of like proto health, you know, consultants and like American, you know, health, like quasi doctors can recommend things like, oh, tomato pills, you know, for constipation, for indigestion, for like, you know, a panacea for anything that ails you, basically. A lot of times these pills were later assessed, found to have no tomato in them at all. But basically you get the sense that like tomatoes have really, the pendulum has swung from like being poisoned to being a health food. And along the way, maybe you figure out they're somewhere in the middle, which is just to say like tasty and like worth eating. So this is so much a Maryland story. And that's the thing we don't think about when we think of tomatoes, which we, again, so strongly associate with Italian cuisine. You know, a lot of this has to do with, again, this infrastructure that's created around the oyster industry. So you've got, you know, in Baltimore, you have this explosion of development around the Industrial Revolution. And I mean, Baltimore was a backwater in the 18th century. And there's this long discussion within the state about muckety mucks are having this conversation. And you can read these documents, these 18th century documents that are like, will Joppatown be the big city or will Baltimore town be the big city? And they really couldn't decide. It's a good thing they chose Baltimore town because Joppatown silted up and no longer has like a navigable harbor. But Baltimore town made it. And so, but it's like still very raw boned and rough, and European visitors to Baltimore like sneering and saying how it's not a real city yet. And like, oh, we can smell the tide, and hating it. But it's a land of opportunity. And especially because you've got all this huge access to natural resources, it's totally untapped. And there's no industry built up around it at all. So this is the land of the B&O Railroad. It's established and it starts to, really pick up in the 1830s. And then you've got the oyster, I'd say canning industry more accurately. So Thomas Kensett and Company, his grandfather develops the tin can and canning and patents it in 1820. And it's kind of this takeoff of Nicolas Appert's canning method or food preservation method in 1812 in France. And basically there's this strong push, especially by Napoleon and by other sort of military leaders, to create a way to preserve food because there really was no way to do it. And people were getting rickets and scurvy and all kinds of things. And so, you needed to be able to preserve food, fresh food, fruit and vegetables in particular, in a way that kept their essence. And so Thomas Kensett's grandfather was able to develop a canning method specifically in cans, not glass, that in the Americas, in New York in the 1820s, it has a very early patent. And his grandson, Thomas Kensett, is enterprising and wants to support a family. And so he moves to Baltimore, which is sort of has this access to huge amounts of oyster stands. And he sets up this canning business with the idea that it's going to be, he talks about creating tinware there on site, but then specifically selling oysters and fruits in particular. And so you can see there's a stereopticon card up at the top that would have showed, I mean, this would have been the most boring stereopticon card, but it's exciting for me. But the idea that you're like sitting back and watching, some oyster packers business. But anyway, I'm so glad that people in posterity were boring. He's created, here we have his business and an advertisement for his business. He starts canning oysters. He's not the first. There are other people that are also canning at the same time. But basically, Baltimore explodes. You've got this way to preserve food. You have this way to transport food, and suddenly you have this way to harvest more than ever. You've got this whole network of boats, skipjacks and boats that are, there's no roads to speak of that are navigable really, but so you're using the water as the highway. The Chesapeake is the highway. And I just want to, for a moment, let you think about the idea you are a 19th century person and you can have peaches in December. You can have tomatoes in March. You are like living high on the hog all year round. They understand the demand for this. Like sometimes I feel like as contemporary people, we forget what it's like to not have and then have these things, right? And yes, it like this explodes. So these images below hopefully show you, this is a great image of tomatoes being unloaded off of a boat in Kent County, Maryland. And then below is an image of boys unloading cans off a freight train. Again, it's a circle, right? Like understand that this process is going to be transformational for Baltimore. It sparks development throughout the whole Chesapeake, though. It's not just Baltimore. So basically any place that you had water could get to you, the rail could meet the water, and then you had either access to, fish, and oysters, or you had access to farmland on the other side. I mean, the Chesapeake was perfectly set up for this, especially after the Civil War, when the rail lines had all been extended to move troops and supplies all around the country. So now it's like perfectly primed. And this is really when everything explodes. After the 1860s, you get this push into true tomato territory. I want to say tomato territory like 10 more times. Anyway, so how do we know there was this proliferation of packing houses? Well, it wasn't just because of their ledger books. It was also because they were advertising. They were competing, just like with oysters. If you look at oyster cans, there's this proliferation of amazing advertising that's so beautiful. And oyster cans are so collectible today because there were so many people packing and shipping oysters, all competing with each other. Maybe 100 in the same city, maybe 50 in the same small city, maybe 8 in the same small town. But again, like think about how many people would have been involved in this whole process. And so you've got this, this proliferation of advertising around tomatoes specifically that talks to they're all the same kind, really. I mean, they only had a couple kinds of sort of, cultivated tomatoes at the time, and they're not really hybrids the way we think of them today. And so they're really the same thing. They're all just being promoted as something different. And so that you would like this brand in particular or that brand and seek them out. And so you see this sort of like explosion of graphic design on cans in this era, all coming out of these packing houses. And these are packing houses that would have worked in oysters in the wintertime and then transitioned to tomatoes and other produce in the summertime. But tomatoes really become ascendant. I mean, there's beans and other things that are, being processed in these packing houses, but tomatoes by and far outstrip them because tomatoes become this fad food. And if you look at 19th century receipts, you can see, tomatoes in aspic and tomatoes, this, sweet, like, I love to go to Smith Island, for example, and a lot of like the foodways there have sort of lingered because they're in isolation, a relative isolation. And so like their stewed tomatoes are sweet. Again, it's sort of like this hangover from the 19th century. Tomatoes were they a fruit? Were they a vegetable? Nobody's really sure. But they're all coming out of the Chesapeake. They're all being grown, packed, picked, shipped, and processed right here, and then being sent out to feed the country across these rail lines, out into the West. There's again, there's a great anecdote I think of about, I don't know how many of you, I feel like I'm exposing myself as like a deep nerd to say this, but I love Laura Ingalls Wilder when I was growing up, like so much. There's some problematic parts of that book now that I can acknowledge, but as a kid, I just loved it. I may have dressed up as her inappropriately in 6th grade. Anyway, just on a regular day, not Halloween. But I love the book so much. There's this whole part in On the Shores of Silver Lake where Laura's basically, her family's so poor they're starving, and they go into this sort of surveyor shack and they find these canned goods on the shelves, and it's peaches and tomatoes. And, it's like her eyes are bulging out of her head to have access to all this bounty. And so again, like put on this 19th century understanding of what it would have been like, and see the appeal, that you could have seasonless food. It just, and food in areas where, it wasn't going to be grown. It was amazing. So the packing process. So this is pretty much the same, no matter where you are. The tomatoes come to you, and they might come by water, sometimes by road, mostly by water, and from farms that are in that particular region. And farmers would, there's a strong incentive for them to sell this crop. It was like high. I mean, think about you blink and all the tomatoes on your plant are ripe at the same time. So, there was this, a huge amount of labor involved in getting ripe tomatoes to the packing house at the peak of their ripeness. And so they're unloaded and they're washed. And you can see that kind of in the middle top photo. They're unloaded off of these big trucks. Then below that, they're blanched. So they're cooked in very hot water and then chilled again so the skins come off, because you don't want skins in your can. And then you're going to do whatever you do. So you're going to put the cans in, you're going to put the tomatoes into the can, seal the cans, cool them down, and then you can add your labels and pack them and ship them. There are other steps, and if you're very interested in this, I'd recommend the Library of Congress actually has a huge amount of photos around the tomato packing industry. And if you want to watch every step of the process with people in old-timey clothes, I'd highly recommend checking it out. It's really like worth a lazy cruise. But I mean, this is really the packing process you see throughout the state. And this is something where unusually you have huge amounts of people turning out to do this work because it is so seasonal and so labor intensive. There's so many steps involved. So I want to talk a little bit about the labor force, and there's definitely a division between the cities and the Chesapeake rural community. So the city being Baltimore, maybe Norfolk, and then the rural community being everything else, including the Chesapeake. In the cities, you had a lot of immigrant labor, specifically immigrant labor, sometimes migrant immigrant labor. So the idea is that basically these huge packing houses, just like the oyster packing houses, there was all sorts of unscrupulous behavior. The idea that you could treat your workers poorly and you'd have more right behind them because, you had another wave of immigrants always coming on. There's all this documentation too of immigrant labor moving and migrant labor who were also immigrants moving around the country to pick different crops in season, and being so poor and having to, have their children employed in this workforce. And so there's some images to the right of some of the migrant labor conditions. And one of the things to consider is you were a migrant worker, one of the benefits, supposed benefits, was that you were going to be giving lodging. And so on the bottom part of that slide, you can see what your lodging would look like. Is that really a benefit? And I mean, these are hay beds. It is a bed, but it's squalor. And these conditions were so concerning, especially because you had children picking and packing and shipping. And, you think about the worst reality of that industrial era, it's not built for human bodies. So it's your hair is ripped out, your fingers are chopped off. It's like it eats people as it eats, technology. And so there's a children's rights, industrial rights activist and documenter his name was Lewis Hine. And so he went and took like amazing photos of these conditions and then wrote about what he saw, interviewed people. And there's a quote from one of his reports down at the bottom. It says, there are several dangers connected with this work when children do it. On every hand, one can see little tots toting boxes or pans full of beans, berries, or tomatoes, and it is self-evident the work is too hard. Then there are machines which no young person should be around. Unguarded belts, wheels, cogs, and the like are a menace to careless children. And I mean, the report goes on to talk about the kind of injuries that they suffered, but there's a sense that there's no regulated education system. There's no sense that you have to be anywhere at any time. And, as new immigrants to the country, you're also being taken advantage of. On the Eastern Shore, it's primarily African-American labor, and it's seasonal. So, you'd be able to go into the packing house, you get paid by what you packed and shipped, not by the hour. But there you also see unscrupulous behavior in sort of tokens being given out as like, you see this in the city too, but tokens are supposed to tally what you've packed, not necessarily work as pay, but they did work as pay in some of these packing houses where they're also used as script currency. And so the idea is that, especially in the city, but occasionally in the country, they'd have actual sort of stores set up, company stores. And so again, this feels very familiar. We understand the idea of sharecropping. This is sort of sharecropping. And so you see these company stores set up where the only currency they'd accept is your tokens from packing. And the only things, you wouldn't get a paycheck, you'd just get your tokens, and you'd only be able to purchase what they had there for exorbitant rates. That's another thing Lewis Hine also talked about in a lot of his reports from this time period. And, the Eastern Shore was a little different in the sense that there wasn't inexhaustible amounts of labor force. So there was a stronger incentive to treat your labor force at least fairly, if not well, because there weren't more of them. There weren't waves of them arriving the way that there were with new immigrant labor. And so if you had a bad reputation and it got around, then people wouldn't work for you anymore. So there was a stronger incentive to kind of, treat your workers fairly, again, even if you didn't treat them particularly well. But again, what's interesting about, seafood packing and fruit canning is that, and tomato canning, obviously, is that it's very much an integrated labor force. Everybody showed up in season to take advantage of what was, fruiting, what was in bloom, what needed to be picked, packed, and shipped. So you could make, some money in that season. And, people would follow that wave around the country as it happened in different, seasonal locations. But Maryland in particular was producing so much in this time period. And, a lot of this is because it hadn't really moved out west yet. So it's the 19th century, California was still in its nascency. There's a sense that it's sort of still the wild, wild west. And so the East Coast is still the epicenter of this type of food production in a way that it, a spoiler alert, wouldn't be like 100 years later. So I want to focus at this point on a particular town, because in all of my research, but also my life experience, Cambridge is a place that feels now like it's turning a corner, but for a long time it felt down on its luck. And it was one of the few towns on the Eastern Shore that people didn't coo over when you told them you were going to Cambridge. You say, oh, St. Michael's, like, oh, Chestertown is so quaint, like, oh, it's the worst word. But, there's a sense of like time had stopped on the Eastern Shore in like a nice way. But often there was a sense with Cambridge that time had stopped in not a nice way. And a lot of that had to do with this very sort of the lingering footprint and echo of tomato packing and seafood packing in that town. So Cambridge is really interesting and different than the rest of the Chesapeake in that it is truly a company town. There were, every town had multiple little packing houses, and Baltimore had hundreds. But Cambridge was dominated by one in particular. And it didn't start that way. It started out as, you had this proliferation of small packing houses around a harbor, but Phillips became this juggernaut, and it just grew and grew and grew and grew. And in the model of Campbell Foods Company, which in New Jersey established around the same time periods, really was its rival for a long time. Cambridge was prosperous because of this. And so you had this big one company, and you could see in the postcard up to the top. I mean, I also love the idea that people in the past sent postcards about big industrial complexes. I mean, like, wish you were here. But anyway, I think about Cambridge and the way it was shaped by this prosperity, where you had the Black community and the white community both working in this packing house. Of course, they would, have occupied different positions, but that echoing, money going through the community, you can see this image of Race Street in 1934, which is, I feel like, a bit of a harbinger. It was named for a mill race, but later that name would be rather apropos. But really, it's dominated by these smokestacks and the production of Phillips Packing Company. And so they packed, you can see they have a waterfront location. They're packing and shipping oysters in the wintertime, and then they're transitioning to tomatoes in the summertime. And they became primarily focused on tomatoes, so much so that they were, Cambridge was called fondly Tomato Town. And there were all sorts of prosperous businesses, not just white, but Black as well. Pine Street in particular was sort of a epicenter of the community. Like many really prosperous African-American downtown areas, it was known as sort of the Black Wall Street. There's businesses that were, from restaurants to salons to clubs. It was part of the Chitlin circuit where Ella Fitzgerald would come and play. And you could go and see big bands. And there was this idea of sort of two communities that were like a Venn diagram. They were each separate, but then they overlapped at Phillips Packing Company. And I think everything was pretty good while everything was good at Phillips. But that wasn't forever. So like most of the rest of the world, but specifically America, in 1937, we're at the height of the Depression. And throughout the Chesapeake, yes, produce still needed to be packed and shipped, but there were fewer people that could afford to buy it. And that meant they needed to produce fewer cans. There was less demand. And so in 1937, it's the Depression era. It's also Jim Crow. It's the height of Jim Crow in the Chesapeake. And one of the things I want to point out is, if you haven't lived here on the Eastern Shore, there is no doubt we are living in the South. Even today, there's like absolutely no doubt. While the industrial part of Maryland has much more of a mid-Atlantic vibe, the Eastern Shore of Maryland does not have that. And so we are looking at a community that, you had this integrated area where everybody worked, and then you went back to your sort of segregated homes. I will also mention, and this is relevant, that the last lynching in Cambridge had been in 1931. And so it was really recent in local memory and experience, to the extent that people that worked together at the packing houses might have been participating in egging it on and encouraging it or fighting against it, all within the same community. There had already been some organizers going in, union organizers going into the packing house, which employed at that point 2,000 people in this 8,000 person town. A quarter of this entire town was employed by Phillips in 1937. And so the Congress of Individual Organizations, which did not discriminate on union membership by sex or by race, started to sort of covertly organize. Just at that point, Phillips announces their plans to reduce the workforce, and there's just this huge wave of resistance, and Black workers and white workers come together to form this huge picket line, where, they're overturning produce trucks and really angry. I mean, this is a town too, where even, as you get closer to the water, this is a community where Phillips and some of the owners of the company had these big estates, and they all lived in the same community, the haves and the have-nots, within walking distance of each other. And so there's a sense of, anger and mistreatment by the workers who are, having their jobs cut, while, the people at the other end of the street are still having eggs and bacon and bread for breakfast. And so there's this, resentment of the leader classes. And so there's this march to the streets, and in return, they sort of strike up this very tentative deal. It's like a small wage increase. They're going to recognize the union, and the union says this isn't enough. And then there's another night of strikes and another night of unrest, and a Black worker throws a truck at a produce truck. So the produce truck drivers at this point are all coming from farms. Their trucks are full of ripe fruit. It's June of 1937. They need to get the produce all packed and shipped and dealt with, and these strikers are in the way, and there's this just fighting and brawling over getting the fruit in. And one of the Black workers at this point, James McKnight, throws a rock, or is said to have thrown a rock, at one of these trucks, and he's arrested and he's taken to jail. And remember, 1931, there had been a lynching where the white mob had stormed the jail and lynched the poor man who was there on, totally unreal charges. By 1937, 6 years later, you have another white mob descending on the jail for the release of the Black striker. So it might have been the only one in Maryland history that descended on the jail there in Dorchester County, pushing for the release of this striker. He was ultimately released. And it wasn't the end of the violence. The next day, one of those produce trucks hit another striker, but it was this unusual coming together that you really don't see in any other packing facility anywhere else in Maryland, any other sort of union situation at all. And it's sort of like these images, there were some incredible images taken, because this strike lasted over several days. It ends up fizzling out. Nothing really happens. No change happens. But there's a sense of unity that creates this really strong sense of contrast in the next few years as the business continues to sort of spiral. So through the World War II period, Phillips is doing really well. They end up getting a contract from the national government, the federal government, to make C rations and K rations. And so they're sort of floating big, but they really can't fight the tide that's happening internationally as California, starts to become this much bigger growing area. And they've got seasonal produce all year round. They don't really need to can it, and they can freeze it and ship it. So they're fighting against this kind of technology that can't happen in Cambridge. It's this old era, it's the last of the candle makers fighting the incandescent light bulb. But the war gets them through, and then by 1961, you see Phillips Company being sold to Consolidated Foods, and very quickly by 1962, the company pretty much goes under. And so 1,000 people or 2,000 people in Cambridge are out of work at least. And you think about the ripple effects, that's 2,000 workers, but how many, they were bringing home a paycheck that fed how many people, supported how many families. And so you go from being this town that's on the make to being this town that's swamped. And I talked to Cambridge residents, African-American residents, about this time period, and they've said, often pinpointed, that this was the point that things really got bad. between the, the white folks and the African-American community, that segregation had always existed, but there had always been this sort of shared common space, third space during the day where you went to work, and you knew everybody. But as that, Phillips closed down, you really saw this, not only sort of have and have nots, but also this deep, the racial divide that had always been there. I mean, this is a land of Harriet Tubman, right? But this deep racial divide deepening even further. So it existed already, and now everyone's poor and struggling, or at least not doing so great. And especially in the Black community, you see a lot of things advancing. The white community is getting things like flushing toilets, and electricity. And the Black side of town, the Pine Street side of town, you have, yes, you had people who were doing okay, but then there were a lot of people that were literally living in chicken coops. And so a lot of those tenants are in properties that are owned by white owners. And, the sense that you cross Race Street and it's, you're a persona non grata, it feels like Jim Crow at its height. And so you have this, this becomes an epicenter of the civil rights era. A woman, Gloria Richardson in the right, who I have to say, like, I have to crush on her. She is magnificent. She is a daughter of Cambridge. She is Howard educated. Her grandfather is a mortician in the community. She starts becoming an activist while she's in college, and she comes back to Cambridge and starts advocating for, civil rights in her community. And the first sort of wave of this comes in 1963, with, you've got there, it's this push for with freedom riders, and freedom riders who are coming in and doing sit-ins there was a restaurant in particular called Disneyland, hard to forget. What did they serve there? I don't know, but apparently it was like horribly segregated, and like a really good example of a restaurant that needed to be integrated. Sit-ins happened there. They also happened in the theater, which had always had a Black balcony, but now the Black seats had been moved to the very back, not even at the front. So there's a sense of, you're disenfranchised already, and now it's like piling on. And the freedom riders come and, offer this idea of hope that maybe that you should have the ability to go to do these things. You should be able to go to a restaurant or movie with the people you used to work with and their kids. And it's in this era in 1963, this is when the sort of the National Guard shows up, because there are two boys. It really comes to a head over two African-American boys who are protesting in a picket line peacefully. They're arrested by the police. They're taken into custody, and then they're sentenced to, what's it called? Well, anyway, they go to juvie. So they're sent to reform school permanently. There's no letting them out. And at this point, the Black community is up in arms, like, come on. Even people that were on the fence are like, this is ridiculous. So at this point, the National Guard is called in and actually occupies Cambridge for a year. This is in 1963, 1964 to 65, they occupied. 1966, more demonstration happens, and a lot of it again. So this is 1967, 1966 is 67. There's this push to integrate the schools, because that's what they're doing across the country. And again, Dorchester County is fighting it and saying, well, they can apply to go to our white schools if they want to, but it's not real integration. And so again, there's this push, and now it's gotten national attention. Senator Kennedy is involved. And at this point, you have major riots that result. So there's a civil rights leader who comes to Cambridge and has this very impassioned speech. And he's basically like, if your school sucks and it's not integrated, then burn it down. If your community sucks and it's not integrated, burn it down. And so later that night, he ends up getting shot with some BBs and arrested by the same people. They shoot him with BBs and then they arrest him. But then it goes on to, you've got this group of people that are really at their wits' end. And so at some point, the local Black public school is set on fire. and the white volunteer fire company says they're uncomfortable going in to put the fire out, and so they let it burn, and the fire spreads, and the whole part of the Black downtown absolutely burns to nothing. The social clubs, the barber shops, the grocery stores, everything, and you can see the destruction in the image at the top. And so, growing up in the 80s, Cambridge was still very much in this lingering after effects of not just the civil rights era, but, it had been publicized in the media that the Black community burned their own community down. And I think, there have been recent interviews with people that lived through that time where they said, no, we were fully ready to burn the school down. The school probably needed to burn down. But we didn't intend the whole community burned because people didn't intervene to put it out. And there's a sense that the white community saw the Black community as something other than them, that wasn't, worthy of that same attention. And it's something that Cambridge has really struggled with. I mean, you go to Cambridge today and it's really like the Hyatt's been built there, and there's this brewery downtown, and there's a sense of, revitalization, but it didn't really mean much until too recently. So much of the packing companies are all gone. And when I think about this idea that the packing company has some responsibility, I mean, I do think that. I think that, the packing company set this idea of prosperity and togetherness within the community. And then once it pulled out, everyone was bereft. And, and we see the after effects when you impoverish an entire community, and that's already where it's so, the inequities are so strong. And Cambridge in particular, out of the Chesapeake, was, the sort of malingerer. And when, it's been such a positive chapter of the history to talk about the revitalization of the packing house. So with the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy and some partners, the last remaining packing house of the Phillips packing house in Cambridge has recently undergone a complete rebuild and revitalization. I went and had a hard hat tour, and a lot of the original elements were still there, but the idea is that it is now, and it's opening a community space. It's a place where it's a business incubator. They have a shucking house inside. They do events. You can go have a beer, and you can dance under the huge smokestacks that define the Phillips Packing Company horizon. It's this, to me, I think it's this sort of full circle moment where it used to be that these packing houses represented opportunity. And for so long, especially in the Chesapeake, as the canning industry fell away, they stopped representing that opportunity. And so this kind of resurgence, revitalization of this one packing house represents, at least in this one community, that it can heal and that it can create a space where everybody can be together. Not like it used to be, a different way, maybe a better way. So that is my talk. I'm happy to take questions. If you have things that you would like me to talk about, I'm happy to answer them in the chat. So let me know. I have a question here in the chat already that says, where were the tomato farms? So they were all around the rural areas, basically. You look at it's interesting. So if you look at a lot of the sort of where they were laid out, it's basically today we look at we see a monoculture landscape. We see corns, soybeans, and wheat. And in the past, that would have been peaches, it would have been tomatoes, it would have been all this other produce. And so in a lot of places, basically any modern agricultural field, in a lot of places that are today, sort of suburban sprawl, that's where we would have seen those tomatoes being grown. Anybody else? Burning tomato question. Interesting side note too. Sometimes during World War II, the labor on some of these tomato farms was POW labor, Germans. It was something, again, my grandfather had a great memory. He remembered meeting German POWs who worked on a tomato farm outside of Church Hill, which is near where I live. But again, it's sort of one of those like interesting side notes in history that, like, you know, POWs here were, or at least American POWs were sent back as to meet the labor shortage, since so many of the soldiers and the troops had gone away. Let's see. Which came first, the canning companies or farm women canning at home? Oh, definitely canning companies. So, you know, a lot of that early technology wouldn't have been available. And I think we view canning as an at-home activity today, but in the early 19th century, it was fully an industrialized process and it was perceived that way. And then it, you know, later on, you know, it's something that you would see people sort of adapting to their own home cooking. And that's where you would have seen something, you know, you would see women take it. That's where it really became like a personal canning process as opposed to an industrial. So I do lots of other talks. And if you want to book me for one, you can visit my website at katelivy.com. Cooperatives. That's a good question on cooperatives running canneries. I don't know the answer to that one. It wouldn't surprise me, but you know, and I will say though, that when it came to canned good product, I mean, you might have people contributing, especially in the early era, you might have a lot of farms contributing, but like there would be one packer, processor, shipper, and promoter, because that part of the process is the part that farmers usually don't have access to. Is the new packing plant development being used by Black people? Is there still Black community in Cambridge? There's a very vibrant Black community in Cambridge. The mayor of Cambridge is African-American. I think there's a sense though on the Eastern Shore that there's a very small Black middle class. And I think, you know, this is a much larger topic, but African-Americans basically, if they could afford to, I mean, this is the land of sort of lack of opportunity. So a lot of people, especially during the Great Migration, moved away and continue to move away. I have younger, I am not that young. I have younger Black friends here on the Eastern Shore that have moved home, but just like me, I mean, there's not a lot of young people that are living on the Eastern Shore either. There's a sense that sort of you leave and you find other opportunity. But, you know, there are people that really do value living in this community, but there are also other people, whether they are Black or white, who feel like this is not a choice that they got to make. So I'm lucky in that I got to choose to come back to the Eastern Shore, but not everybody feels that way. Oh, that's a really cool. There's somebody said, my mother worked during World War II in Cambridge in the packing house doing testing. She remembers a POW. She says that her mother talked about the tomatoes being from Anne Arundel County being special. Oh, I like that. I did a bunch of research to try to figure out what varietal of tomatoes they were growing. I couldn't actually find that out. Is there a resource that shows the location of all the tomato packers that used to exist? Sadly, there is not. So if you are interested and you want to share, we'd love for you to make a map for the rest of us history folks that would like to know exactly where they were. But really, it's kind of, it just superimposed the list of packers, you know, around the state that did oysters, and you kind of have a sense of who was packing tomatoes. Have I ever eaten a canned oyster? If you've ever eaten an oyster that's been put in one of those tubs, you know, the plastic tubs that you can get at the grocery store, fully eaten those. And they're not bad. I mean, but they're not really meant to be eaten like on the half shell. They're meant to be eaten in stuff. So they're not bad. Why did ConAgra close the packing plant? Well, I mean, because they couldn't compete. So businesses closed because, I mean, for it's very simple business reasons, right? Like, you know, the Eastern Shore stopped being this like, exceptional producer of tomatoes and the cheapest producer of tomatoes. If you started producing them in California, you could grow them all year long. They were no longer seasonal. You had an influx of inexpensive labor, which is to say migrants who were coming from Mexico. And you also had access to frozen food technology. And so, the Eastern Shore just got outstripped, as we move further west and the West, the West Coast developed their own, growing industry. It just, the East Coast just couldn't pick up. When did crab packing come into Cambridge? Great question. So you really see that in the very early 20th century, and it's because of pasteurization, but also refrigeration. So oysters can be packed and shipped cold in the cold months, but crab spoil so easily, and it needed refrigerated cars and refrigerated technology as well as pasteurization to keep the crab meat fresh. So, oh Lord, I hope you guys are entertained because, I've talked for a long time. Let's see, POWs come from Fort Meade where they were housed. That's a good question. Again, I don't know that specifically. I just know that there were POWs here. But again, as my old professor used to say, that would be a great subject of a research paper, which I would totally read. So I'd just like to thank everybody. Oh, hang on. Aren't tomatoes still being grown on the Eastern Shore? Is a local food movement revitalizing tomato growth in Maryland? So yes, there are tomatoes being grown on the Eastern Shore, but it's, it's more, you think of the way that farmers markets operate today. It's not in this sort of huge mass production footprint. It's in this, we value today and we'll pay more for local produce. And so, yes, I mean, you can go to your farmer's market in the summertime and see tomatoes from Maryland everywhere and eat some BLTs and be just so happy and fat that you had that delicious thing. Well, it is almost 8 o'clock. Thank you, everybody who came tonight to listen to my big tomato talk. I hope you learned a lot and had some fun. And now you've got more food for thought. So thanks so much, everybody.
Kate, thank you for sharing this important Maryland story. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. From the chat, it looks like we may be asking Kate back to talk about crabs and crabbing. We'll have to talk about that later. Kate has allowed us to record tonight's program, so everyone who registered will receive an email with the link to the recording when it becomes available on YouTube. Jack will be back on Tuesday, November 15th for the next Baltimore Narratives program, Radio Comes to Baltimore. You'll receive an email with the link to register after tonight's program. You'll also receive a link to Kate's program from last fall. If you enjoyed tonight's program, I recommend watching A Damned Land. Kate talks about how Chesapeake dams, for mills and for power, have transformed the environment and shaped the region's economy and culture from the 17th century to today. Have a great night, everyone. I hope to see you again next month.